On March 14, 1849, the county courthouse in Lowndes County, Alabama, burned to the ground in what officials called an unfortunate accident caused by an overturned lamp. But among the ashes, investigators found something that didn't match the official story. 3 sets of human remains in the basement, chained to iron rings embedded in the stone walls. The county clerk's records from 1847 to 1849 were completely destroyed, along with property deeds, marriage certificates, and most crucially, the probate documents for the Sutton estate. For over a century, descendants of Lowndes County families have whispered about what really happened at Bell River Plantation during those 2 years, about the twin daughters of Colonel Nathaniel Sutton, and about the slave named Marcus, who somehow managed to document everything before he vanished. What you're about to hear has been pieced together from surviving letters, medical records from Mobile, and testimonies given to a Northern abolitionist society that was sealed until 1963. Before we continue with the story of the Sutton sisters and the secrets that consumed an entire community, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell. We uncover the darkest corners of American history that textbooks won't touch. And leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We love knowing where our audience discovers these forgotten horrors. The truth about Bell River Plantation begins not with the fire, but with a funeral 2 years earlier, and with 2 women who had been taught that survival meant absolute control. Lowndes County in 1847 stretched across some of the richest cotton-growing soil in Alabama, black earth that made men wealthy and carved the landscape into kingdoms of white columned houses surrounded by fields that reached the horizon. The county seat of Hayneville sat at the center of it all, a collection of brick buildings and dirt streets where planters conducted business, and their wives pretended not to know where the family wealth truly came from. Bell River Plantation lay 8 miles south of town, accessible only by a private road that wound through stands of water oak and across 2 tributaries of the Alabama River. Colonel Nathaniel Sutton had built the main house in 1828, a 3-story structure with 12 rooms and a separate kitchen building connected by a covered walkway. The slave quarters, 24 cabins arranged in 2 precise rows, sat a quarter-mile behind the main house, close enough to be summoned quickly, far enough that the colonel didn't have to hear the sounds of the lives he owned. The colonel had made his fortune in cotton, but his reputation came from something else entirely. He'd served in the Creek War under Andrew Jackson, and brought back from that conflict a belief that humans could be improved through careful breeding, the same way one improved livestock. His library contained medical texts from Philadelphia, agricultural journals from Virginia, and personal correspondence with men at universities who shared his convictions about racial hierarchies and biological destiny. He kept meticulous records, measurements, observations, genealogies traced back 3 generations. His neighbors called him eccentric but brilliant. His slaves called him something else entirely, though never where white ears could hear. The colonel never married. Instead, he'd purchased a slave woman named Ruth in 1824 from a Charleston trader, a woman described in the bill of sale as of uncommonly fair complexion and genteel bearing. Ruth gave birth to twin daughters in 1825, Sarah and Catherine. The colonel raised them in the main house, educated them with tutors from Mobile, dressed them in fine clothes ordered from New Orleans. But he never freed them. He never acknowledged them as his daughters in any legal document. On paper, they remained his property, an arrangement that gave him absolute authority over every aspect of their existence. Sarah and Catherine grew up in a peculiar isolation. They learned to read and write, to paint watercolors and play the pianoforte. They studied literature and mathematics, geography and French, but they rarely left the plantation grounds. The colonel controlled who visited and when, screening every potential social contact through his own rigid criteria. He told them they were special, that they had been given advantages that elevated them above their station, but that the world beyond Bell River would never understand or accept them. He taught them that safety came from seclusion, that trust was a weakness and that power, however limited, was the only currency that mattered. The twins learned these lessons too well. They developed their own language of glances and gestures, finishing each other's sentences, sometimes falling silent for days and communicating only through notes passed across the dinner table. They wore identical dresses in coordinating colors, Sarah in deep green, Catherine in midnight blue. They read the same books at the same pace, one starting at the front, one at the back, meeting in the middle. They shared everything: hairbrushes, jewelry, secrets, and eventually something darker. Their mother Ruth died in 1839, officially from pneumonia, though the slave quarters whispered about bruises on her arms and fear in her eyes during her final weeks. After her death, the colonel's control over his daughters tightened like a noose. He installed locks on their bedroom doors that could only be opened from the outside. He required them to submit weekly written reports on their activities, their thoughts, their dreams. He began testing them, leaving valuables in obvious places to see if they would steal, introducing them to male visitors to observe their reactions, creating situations designed to reveal any hidden rebellions. The plantation itself prospered through these years. By 1847, the colonel owned 63 enslaved people whose labor produced 142 bales of cotton annually. He sold his crop through factors in Mobile and invested the profits in more land, more slaves, more books for his ever-growing library. The slave population at Bell River had an unusual demographic profile and disproportionate number of light-skinned individuals, more children than the birth rate should have produced, and a disturbing pattern of families separated and sold away just as children reached adolescence. The overseer, a man named Jonas Pritchett, had worked at Bell River for 15 years. He lived in a cottage near the slave quarters and carried out the colonel's orders with mechanical precision. Pritchett kept his own records: punishment logs, work assignments, dietary restrictions for slaves the colonel had designated for his breeding program. These notebooks, written in Pritchett's cramped handwriting, documented atrocities with the casual tone of farming reports. Which women were forced into which cabins, which children were sired by which men, which pregnancies were terminated and by what methods. In the main house, Sarah and Catherine understood more than their father realized. They read his journals when he traveled to Mobile on business. They listened at doors and gathered fragments of conversations between Pritchett and the colonel. They knew what happened in the quarters after dark, knew which of the slaves were their half-siblings, knew that their father viewed human beings as experimental subjects in his personal laboratory of racial theory, and they learned to hate him with a cold, patient fury that would have terrified him if he'd recognized it. The morning of February 3, 1847 arrived with unseasonable warmth, temperatures climbing into the low 60s even before noon. Colonel Sutton had spent the previous evening in his study, working by lamplight on correspondence with a professor at the Medical College of South Carolina. The household staff noticed nothing unusual when he failed to appear for breakfast. He often worked through the night and slept late. It was Pritchett who found him at 10:30, slumped in his leather chair with papers scattered across his desk. The colonel's face had a greyish tinge, and when Pritchett touched his hand to wake him, the skin felt cold and waxy. Dr. Amos Grayfield arrived from Hayneville 2 hours later and pronounced Colonel Nathaniel Sutton dead, estimating the time of death as sometime between midnight and dawn. Heart seizure, Dr. Grayfield declared, barely glancing at the body. Man was 56 years old, worked himself to exhaustion. I'd warned him about his choleric temperament and excessive mental strain. The heart gives out, simple as that. But several details didn't align with this tidy diagnosis. The colonel's dinner tray, brought to the study at 8 o'clock the previous evening, sat on a side table with the food barely touched. A cup of coffee, long since gone cold, showed a peculiar residue at the bottom, a fine sediment that glittered faintly in the lamplight. The colonel's final letter, addressed to his attorney in Mobile, remained unfinished mid-sentence. I have made certain arrangements regarding the future of my daughters, which must be executed precisely as stipulated, for their own protection, and for the preservation of my life's work. Should any person attempt to—" The sentence ended there, the pen trailing off the page, as if his hand had suddenly lost strength. Sarah and Catherine stood together in the hallway outside their father's study, wearing matching black mourning dresses that they'd somehow procured despite having no prior knowledge of his death. Their faces showed no tears, no evidence of shock or grief. They held hands, fingers interlaced, and watched the proceedings with identical expressions of watchful calm. "We should examine him more thoroughly," suggested Mr. Harold Breckenridge, a neighboring planter who'd arrived to pay his respects. "Nathaniel was in good health last month when I saw him at the courthouse. This seems rather sudden." The colonel worked himself into the grave. "Doctor," Grayfield snapped, irritated at having his professional judgment questioned. "I've seen it 100 times. The body simply gives out. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to speak with the daughters about funeral arrangements." But Dr. Grayfield never got that conversation. Sarah addressed him first, her voice perfectly modulated and cold as January rain. "Dr. Grayfield, we appreciate your prompt attendance. The funeral will be held 3 days hence with burial in the family plot. Mr. Jeremiah Osgood, our father's attorney from Mobile, has been summoned and should arrive by tomorrow evening. Until such time as the will is read and the estate settled, Catherine and I will manage the plantation affairs. Pritchett will continue as overseer under our direct supervision." The men in the room exchanged glances. Women didn't manage plantations, certainly not unmarried women barely 22 years old. And there was something else, something they couldn't quite articulate. A sense that Sarah and Catherine had been waiting for this moment, that they'd rehearsed these words and knew exactly how events would unfold. "Now, Miss Sarah," Mr. Breckenridge began in the patronizing tone men reserved for women discussing matters beyond their comprehension. "You can't seriously expect to—" "Our father educated us specifically for this eventuality," Catherine interrupted, her voice a mirror of her sister's. "We understand crop rotation, market factors, the management of field labor. We've studied his methods for years. This plantation will continue to operate at its current level of productivity." What the men didn't know, couldn't know, was that Sarah and Catherine had prepared for this day for months. They'd studied their father's account books, memorized the names and capabilities of every enslaved person on the property, learned which merchants in Hayneville could be manipulated and which needed to be avoided. They'd planned for every contingency except one, the specific contents of their father's will. The funeral took place on February 6th, under gray skies that threatened rain but never delivered. 43 neighbors and business associates attended, gathering in the parlor where the colonel's body lay in a walnut casket lined with white satin. The Reverend Samuel Yates from Hayneville's Presbyterian Church delivered a eulogy that praised the colonel's contributions to Alabama's agricultural prosperity and his devotion to advancing scientific knowledge. Not one enslaved person from Bell River attended the service, though they gathered in the quarters that evening for their own ceremony, a mixture of Christian hymns and older traditions, singing songs that celebrated liberation and the settling of accounts. They kept their voices low, but the sound carried across the fields to where Sarah and Catherine sat on the main house veranda, listening. "They think they're free now," Sarah said softly. "They'll learn differently," Catherine replied. Jeremiah Osgood arrived from Mobile the evening after the funeral, a portly man of 50 with silver hair and the careful manner of someone accustomed to delivering bad news to people who could afford to make his life difficult. He carried a leather satchel containing Colonel Sutton's will and several sealed documents marked for the twins' eyes only. The reading took place in the colonel's study, now thoroughly cleaned of any evidence of his final hours. Sarah and Catherine sat together on a settee, their black mourning dresses rustling slightly as they adjusted their positions. Pritchett stood by the door, uninvited but tolerated, his weathered face expressionless. Osgood opened his satchel and withdrew a thick document bound with black ribbon. Colonel Sutton revised his will on December 12, 1846, less than 2 months before his death. The provisions are unconventional. The document's opening paragraphs were standard: charitable bequests to the Presbyterian Church, personal items distributed to various acquaintances. Then Osgood reached the section concerning the plantation and its inhabitants. To my daughters Sarah and Catherine Sutton, I leave the entirety of Bell River Plantation, including all lands, structures, livestock, equipment, and human property, to be held jointly and equally between them. However, this bequest is conditional upon the following stipulations, which must be satisfied within 24 months of my death. Osgood paused, cleared his throat uncomfortably, and continued. First, both daughters must enter into lawful Christian marriage with men of suitable character and standing, approved by the executor of this estate. Second, both marriages must produce legitimate offspring within the stipulated time frame. Third, the daughters must maintain the plantation at current levels of productivity and demonstrate sound management of its resources. Sarah's hand tightened on Catherine's, their knuckles going white. Should these conditions not be met, Osgood read, his voice dropping lower, Bell River Plantation and all its assets shall be sold at public auction, with proceeds distributed equally among the following charitable institutions. The list included agricultural colleges, medical societies, and organizations dedicated to the advancement of scientific understanding of human populations. The Colonel's final attempt to ensure his ideology outlived him. There's more, Osgood said, withdrawing a second document. A private letter to you both. He handed the sealed envelope to Sarah, who broke the wax seal with her thumbnail. Inside, their father's handwriting covered 3 pages of heavy cotton paper. Catherine leaned close, and they read together in silence. The letter explained the Colonel's reasoning with chilling clarity. He'd observed their unnatural attachment to each other, their rejection of normal feminine interests in courtship and marriage. He'd concluded that they would never voluntarily separate, never form appropriate alliances with men who could continue his work and properly manage his estate. So he'd created a situation where they had no choice: marry and procreate, or lose everything. But the letter's final paragraph contained something more disturbing. I have made arrangements to ensure you choose wisely. My network of correspondence extends throughout the state and beyond. They will be watching, reporting back on your conduct and your choices. Remember always that you are what I made you, and you cannot escape the fundamental truth of your nature, no matter how you might pretend otherwise. The blood that flows through your veins is both your privilege and your prison. Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. When she looked up at Osgood, her expression betrayed nothing. We understand the terms. Who serves as executor? I do, along with Mr. Breckenridge as co-executor. We're charged with approving any marriage proposals and ensuring the conditions are met. 24 months, Catherine said. That gives us until February 1849. Correct. I must say, ladies, your father's provisions are highly irregular. Most attorneys would have counseled against. Our father's mind was entirely his own, Sarah interrupted. We'll comply with his wishes. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have plantation business to attend to. After Osgood left, promising to return in 6 months to assess their progress, the twins remained in the study. They sat in their father's chair, Catherine on the seat, Sarah perched on the armrest, and looked at the walls lined with journals and medical texts, at the ledgers documenting 2 decades of human experimentation disguised as agricultural management. We can't find suitable husbands in 24 months, Catherine said finally. He knew that. He designed this to fail. Not if we control every variable, Sarah replied. Father taught us that much. He believed humans could be bred like livestock, that every aspect of reproduction could be managed and directed. We'll prove him right, just not the way he intended. What are you suggesting? Sarah stood and moved to their father's desk, pulling open the bottom drawer where he'd kept his most private records. She withdrew a leather-bound journal and flipped it open to a page marked with a silk ribbon. father's breeding logs. He documented everything, which combinations produced which results, which bloodlines he considered superior, which individuals he designated for his program. Catherine joined her, reading over her shoulder. The entries were clinical, dehumanizing, describing people as if they were cattle. Purchased male, approximately 25 years, from Williamson Estate. Good teeth, strong back, quick to learn tasks. Letters visible on back indicate prior ownership in Virginia, paired with female number 4. Results: 1 male child, sold 1837. 1 female child, retained for future breeding. He was a monster, Catherine whispered. He was, Sarah agreed. But he was also thorough, and somewhere in these records is the solution to our problem. Over the following weeks, Sarah and Catherine absorbed themselves in their father's documentation. They discovered the full scope of his obsessions, journals spanning 20 years, detailed genealogies, physical measurements, observations on temperament and capability. He'd treated Bell River as a laboratory, its enslaved population as experimental subjects, all in service of his theories about racial hierarchies and human improvement. But within that documentation they found something unexpected: evidence of intelligence, resilience, and resistance among the very people their father had tried to reduce to data points. Slaves who'd taught themselves to read despite prohibitions. Women who'd used herbs and folk knowledge to control their own fertility, quietly subverting the Colonel's breeding program. Men who'd sabotaged equipment and slowed productivity in ways that appeared accidental. Their father had noted these deficiencies without recognizing them as acts of rebellion. One name appeared repeatedly in the later journals, always with annotations of frustration: Ruth, their mother. The Colonel had purchased her expecting a compliant bearer of children for his experiments. Instead, he'd found a woman who resisted him in subtle, persistent ways, teaching her daughters to read when he was away, whispering to them about the life she'd known before slavery, planting seeds of doubt about his absolute authority. "She tried to protect us," Catherine said, tracing her finger over their mother's name in the ledger. "Even when she couldn't save herself." "Then we owe her more than survival," Sarah replied. "We owe her victory. But victory required resources, time, and one more element they didn't yet possess. A man they could control completely, whose presence would satisfy the letter of their father's will while violating its spirit entirely." The solution arrived in late April, though they didn't recognize it immediately. The spring auction in Hayneville drew sellers and buyers from across central Alabama, transforming the courthouse square into a marketplace of human misery. Enslaved people stood on a raised platform, while white men examined them like livestock, checking teeth and muscle tone, asking invasive questions about work history and health. The air smelled of dust and sweat and fear. Sarah and Catherine attended with Pritchett, ostensibly to purchase additional field hands for the expanded acreage they planned to cultivate. They wore black veils, still in mourning, which gave them anonymity in the crowd and allowed them to observe without being observed too closely. The morning sales proceeded predictably. Field workers going to plantation owners, domestic slaves to town families, children torn from parents and sold to different buyers. Then, shortly before noon, something unusual appeared on the auction block. "Next lot," the auctioneer called. "Property of the Granville estate, recently deceased. 1 male, age approximately 28, name of Marcus. Got his letters, can figure, worked as a house servant and tutor to the Granville children. No history of rebellion, no attempts to run. Starting bid, $1,000. Marcus stood on the platform with straight posture and level gaze, neither defiant nor submissive. He wore clean but worn clothing, and his hands, the hands of someone who worked with ledgers rather than cotton, showed no calluses. His skin was several shades lighter than most of the people sold that morning, suggesting mixed ancestry. But what caught Sarah's attention was something else entirely: the way he scanned the crowd. Not with the defeated resignation she expected, but with calculation, as if he was evaluating potential buyers just as they evaluated him. "Educated slaves are risk," someone in the crowd called out. "Gets ideas above his station. Perfect for a household that needs bookkeeping done," the auctioneer countered. "How many of you can balance your own accounts? Here's a man who can do it for you. Now do I hear 1,000? The bidding opened slowly. Most planters didn't want an educated male slave. Too much potential for trouble, for reading abolitionist newspapers, for forging travel passes. But a few town merchants showed interest, seeing value in someone who could manage their stores or handle correspondence. Sarah leaned close to Pritchett. "Bid." "Miss Sarah, we don't need bid." Pritchett raised his hand. 1,000. 1,200, countered a merchant from Montgomery. 1,300, Pritchett called. The bidding climbed to 1,600 before the Montgomery merchant dropped out, shaking his head at the inflated price for a single male slave, educated or not. Sarah had paid more than market value, a fact that would fuel gossip in the weeks ahead. Marcus was delivered to Bell River 3 days later, walking the 8 miles from Hayneville with his few possessions in a cloth bag. Pritchett met him at the plantation entrance and led him directly to the main house, where Sarah and Catherine waited in the study. "You can read and write," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." Marcus's voice was educated, careful, revealing nothing of what he might be thinking. "You tutored the Granville children. What did you teach them?" "Reading, writing, arithmetic, some geography and history. Whatever their father requested." Catherine circled him slowly, appraising. "The Granvilles were known abolitionists, Quakers, I believe. They allowed their slaves to be educated?" For the first time, something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Wariness, perhaps, or recognition that this conversation was more complicated than it appeared. "Mr. Granville believed all people possessed souls and minds worthy of development, ma'am." "And you?" Sarah asked. "What do you believe?" "I believe I'm standing in front of 2 women who paid too much for me and who clearly have something specific in mind beyond field labor." The twins exchanged glances. Their father had taught them to view enslaved people as objects, incapable of analysis or autonomous thought. Marcus had just demonstrated both within 30 seconds. "We have an unusual situation," Sarah said carefully. "Our father died recently, leaving conditions on our inheritance that require creative solutions. We need someone educated, discreet, and capable of understanding complex arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" "The kind that must remain private within this household," Catherine replied. "You'll live in the main house, not the quarters. You'll have access to our father's library. You'll be treated well, fed properly, given freedoms that would be extraordinary elsewhere. But in exchange, you'll do exactly what we say, when we say it, without question or hesitation." Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "And if I refuse these unnamed terms, then you'll be sold south," Sarah said flatly. "To cotton plantations in Mississippi where educated slaves are worked to death in the fields to break them of any intellectual pretensions. I can have you on a boat within a week." It wasn't an empty threat, and Marcus clearly knew it. "What do you want from me?" "That depends," Catherine said. "Can you keep secrets, even ones that could be used as weapons?" "I've kept secrets my entire life, ma'am. Had to survive." Sarah walked to the window, looking out across the plantation grounds. "Our father's will requires us to marry within 24 months or lose everything. But we have no intention of submitting to marriages arranged by men who view us as property to be managed. So we're going to subvert the terms while technically fulfilling them." "I don't understand." "You will," Catherine said. "But first we need to know if you can be trusted, completely and absolutely." Over the following days, Sarah and Catherine tested Marcus in ways both subtle and overt. They gave him access to their father's library and watched what he read. They asked his opinions on political matters and listened for hints of abolitionist sympathies. They observed how he interacted with the other enslaved people at Bell River, whether he attempted to organize or agitate. Marcus proved remarkably adaptable. He kept to himself, spoke carefully, and demonstrated an intelligence that had clearly been honed through years of navigating dangerous social terrain. He understood that educated slaves existed in a precarious position, valuable enough to be kept, dangerous enough to be feared. What the twins didn't know, couldn't know yet, was that Marcus had his own secrets and his own agenda. The Granvilles had indeed been Quakers with abolitionist leanings. More than that, they'd been part of an informal network that collected testimony from enslaved people about the realities of plantation life. Marcus had spent 5 years documenting atrocities, recording names and dates and details in a coded shorthand he'd developed. When the Granvilles died, both within a week of each other from fever, their relatives had sold off the estate, including Marcus, before anyone could discover the trunk hidden in the root cellar containing years of carefully preserved evidence. Marcus had managed to retrieve his most important notebooks before the sale, hiding them in a hollowed-out Bible that no white person bothered to inspect. He'd been bought and brought to Bell River expecting another period of careful observation and documentation. Instead, he found himself at the center of something far stranger and potentially more dangerous. By mid-May, the arrangement had clarified. Marcus would serve as the twins' private secretary, managing household accounts and correspondence. But more than that, he would be their confidant in a scheme they hadn't yet fully explained. Sarah revealed their plan one evening in early June, after the house slaves had retired to their quarters and the 3 of them were alone in the study. "Our father's will requires us to marry and bear children within 24 months, she began. "The executors must approve our choice of husbands, men of suitable character and standing. But the will says nothing about the husbands being suitable for us, only that they meet external criteria." "I'm not following," Marcus said. Catherine smiled, and there was something almost feral in it. "We're going to marry men we can control completely. Elderly men, or sickly ones, or men desperate enough for the connection to a wealthy plantation that they'll agree to any terms. Men who will give us legal legitimacy without interference in how we run Bell River." "And the children?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to understand. "Biology is biology," Sarah said bluntly. "Our father spent 20 years proving that. Lineage can be strategically managed. The executors need to see marriages and pregnancies. They don't need to see what happens behind closed doors." The full implications hit Marcus like cold water. They wanted him to father their children, to create the appearance of legitimate heirs, while the twins maintained control through marriages that existed only on paper. "You're asking me to commit an act that could get all of us killed," he said slowly. "If anyone discovered—" "No one will discover," Catherine interrupted. "We control this household completely. The marriages will be arranged carefully. We'll manage every detail, every possible witness, every piece of evidence. You'll be protected." "Protected?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "I'm a slave. There's no protection for me if this fails. You'll be ruined socially, perhaps sent away somewhere. I'll be hanged or burned alive, which is why you'll be motivated to ensure it doesn't fail," Sarah said. "And in exchange, you'll receive something worth the risk." "What could possibly be worth—" "Freedom," Catherine said quietly. "Documented legal freedom. And enough money to go north and start a new life. We'll wait until after the children are born and the estate is secure. Then we'll manumit you, provide funds, and send you away with a cover story that holds up to scrutiny." Marcus looked between them, searching for deception or false promises. "And if I refuse?" "You won't," Sarah said with certainty. "Because you want freedom more than you fear death, and you're smart enough to recognize this as your only real chance." She was right, and he knew it. But there was something else at play, something the twins hadn't considered. Marcus saw in their scheme not just a path to personal freedom, but an opportunity to document and expose the entire system. If he could gather evidence about the Sutton family's secrets, about the Colonel's experiments, about the network of planters and overseers who'd collaborated in decades of atrocities, he could send that information north and strike a blow against the institution that had stolen his life. "I'll do it," he said finally, "on one condition." "You're not in a position to make conditions," Catherine said. "I am, if you want my cooperation rather than my resentful compliance. I want to know everything. Your father's journals, his correspondence, his breeding logs, all of it. If I'm risking my life for this scheme, I deserve to understand the full context." The twins considered this. Giving Marcus unrestricted access to their father's papers was dangerous, but refusing might create exactly the resentful compliance he'd mentioned. "Agreed," Sarah said. "But you'll study them here, in this room under our supervision. Nothing leaves this house." Acceptable. What none of them said aloud was that they'd each just made a bargain with someone they didn't fully trust, gambling their futures on a deception so audacious it could only succeed if every element aligned perfectly. And in Lowndes County, Alabama in 1847, perfection was in very short supply. Aumento de tensión. The summer months brought oppressive heat to Bell River, the kind that made the air thick as syrup and turned every physical task into an ordeal. But inside the main house, behind closed shutters and drawn curtains, a different kind of pressure built. Sarah and Catherine began their search for suitable husbands with the cold calculation their father had taught them. They needed men who met the executor's criteria for character and standing, while being vulnerable enough to manipulate. They compiled a list from Osgood's suggestions and their own observations of Lowndes County society. The first candidate was Mr. Edmund Varley, a 68-year-old widower whose cotton operation had struggled since his sons moved west to seek opportunities in Texas. Varley had been a friend of the Colonel's and expressed immediate interest when approached about a potential match with one of the twins. "A beautiful opportunity," he declared during his first visit to Bell River in July, his watery eyes roaming over Catherine with an expression that made her skin crawl. "Union of two fine properties, continuation of your father's legacy. I'd be honored to guide you through the complexities of plantation management." Catherine smiled and said nothing. After Varley left, she scrubbed her hands raw in the wash basin as if she could remove the memory of his palm on her arm during the tour of the grounds. "He'll do," Sarah said clinically. "He's desperate to restore his reputation after last year's failed crop. He'll agree to any prenuptial terms to secure the connection." "I can't," Catherine whispered. "Sarah, I can't let him touch me." "He won't. That's the point. The marriage is legal fiction. Marcus fathers the child, Varley gets credit, and we maintain control." But arranging two such marriages proved more complex than anticipated. The executors, particularly Breckinridge, had strong opinions about suitable matches. When Sarah suggested she might marry a merchant from Mobile, a man of 42 with moderate success in the cotton trade, Breckinridge rejected him immediately. "Unsuitable background," he declared. "Your father intended you to marry into established planter families, not commercial classes. The man's grandfather was an indentured servant, for God's sake." The twins pushed back, arguing that the will's language didn't specify planter families, only men of suitable character and standing. But Breckinridge held firm, threatening to petition the courts to clarify the will's intent if they continued pushing inappropriate candidates. "He's trying to force us into marriages that benefit him," Sarah fumed after one particularly contentious meeting. "He has sons, you realize. He's probably angling to marry one of us off to his own family." While the marriage negotiations dragged on, Marcus immersed himself in Colonel Sutton's papers. What he found there exceeded his worst expectations. The Colonel's breeding program had operated for 2 decades with systematic brutality. He'd forced specific pairings, sold away children who didn't meet his criteria, and separated families with no consideration for human bonds. He documented everything in clinical language that dehumanized people into data points. Female number 7 shows resistance to breeding assignments. Recommend increased discipline and isolation to induce compliance. But the journals also contained something else, evidence of a network. The colonel hadn't worked in isolation. He corresponded with other planters, with medical professionals, with academics at southern universities. They exchanged research findings, compared methodologies, and discussed ways to advance their theories about racial hierarchies and human improvement. Marcus began making careful copies of the most damning entries, using paper Sarah provided for household accounts and writing late at night when the twins had retired. He developed a system for hiding his copied pages inside a hollowed-out section of his mattress, building a secret archive that would eventually travel north. But he also began to notice something the twins didn't mention: the pattern of illness among Belle River's enslaved population. In late July, 3 women in the quarters developed symptoms: lesions, fever, progressive weakness. Pritchett reported it casually, suggesting they be isolated and given minimal care until they recovered or died. But Marcus had read the colonel's private medical notes and recognized what he was seeing: syphilis. The colonel had infected multiple women, either deliberately as part of his research or through his systematic sexual abuse. Now the disease was spreading through the quarters, passed between couples, transmitted from mothers to infants. Marcus brought his findings to Sarah and Catherine one evening, laying out the medical texts he'd found with their father's annotations. Your father gave them syphilis. Either he contracted it himself and spread it, or he exposed them deliberately. The journals suggest both. And it's killing them. Catherine's face went pale. How many? At least 7 showing symptoms now, but syphilis can remain dormant for years. There's no way to know how many are infected without proper medical examination, and even then, he trailed off, the futility evident. Sarah stood abruptly and walked to the window, her back rigid. Can it be treated? Mercury treatments sometimes, but they're almost as dangerous as the disease itself, and expensive, and would require a doctor willing to treat enslaved people properly, which Marcus didn't need to finish that sentence either. Do it anyway, Sarah said without turning around. Purchase whatever medicines are needed from Mobile. Have Dr. Grayfield come out, and if he refuses to treat them adequately, find someone who will. Miss Sarah, the cost. I don't care about the cost. Our father did this. We're not going to let them die from his depravity. It was the first crack in the facade Marcus had seen, the first indication that the twins might be motivated by something beyond self-preservation. He filed it away as valuable intelligence. Dr. Grayfield arrived 2 days later, irritated at being summoned to treat slaves. He examined the sick women with barely concealed disgust, confirmed the diagnosis, and prescribed mercury treatments with the cheerful confidence of someone who didn't particularly care whether the patient survived. Course of treatment takes months, he said, washing his hands in the basin a house servant provided. Can't guarantee results. Frankly, might be more economical to just isolate them and let nature take its course. Replace them with healthy stock. We'll take your prescription, Catherine said coldly, and we'll need you to examine the entire slave population. Everyone. Identify all potential cases. Grayfield's eyebrows rose. That's 40+ people. The expense is ours to bear. When can you begin? The examinations took place over 3 days in August, conducted in a cabin Pritchett cleared for the purpose. Grayfield worked with mechanical efficiency, noting symptoms in a ledger and dispensing diagnoses with the bedside manner of a livestock inspector. The final count was worse than Marcus had feared. 14 confirmed cases, another 8 probables. Nearly a third of Belle River's enslaved population had been infected by the colonel's systematic abuse. Sarah and Catherine absorbed this information in silence. Then Sarah made a decision that would have shocked their father and confused their neighbors. We're treating all of them, she announced. Purchase the mercury, the bandages, whatever's needed. Improved rations for the sick. They need strength to survive the treatment. Reduced work quotas. And Marcus, you'll oversee the treatments. Keep detailed records of who receives what and their progress. Miss Sarah, Pritchett objected, this is going to cost thousands of dollars and reduce productivity significantly. Your father would never. Our father did this to them, Catherine interrupted. "We're correcting his damage. The expense is irrelevant." What the twins didn't articulate, even to each other, was the complex motivation behind their decision. Partly it was pragmatic. Dead slaves couldn't work, and the plantation's value depended on its labor force. Partly it was guilt, recognizing their complicity in their father's system even as his victims. But partly it was something else, something neither wanted to examine too closely. The recognition that their father's greatest crime wasn't the specific atrocities he'd committed, but the fundamental belief that other people existed only as instruments for his purposes. They'd been raised to think the same way. Now, confronted with the human cost of that worldview, they were being forced to choose what kind of people they would become. Marcus watched these developments with growing confusion. He'd expected to find monsters at Bell River, people who viewed him as less than human. Instead, he'd found two women who'd been made into something twisted by their father's abuse, who were now struggling to untangle their own humanity from the poison he'd fed them. It didn't make them allies. It didn't mean he trusted them. But it complicated his simple narrative of oppressor, and oppressed in ways that made his documentation more difficult. While Marcus grappled with moral complexity, the marriage negotiations reached a crisis point. In September, Breckenridge arrived at Bell River with a proposal. His nephew, Thomas Breckenridge, age 34, recently returned from New Orleans, where his cotton brokerage had failed due to what was delicately termed unfortunate investments. Thomas needed a fresh start and a wealthy connection. Sarah needed a husband the executors would approve. "Perfect match," Breckenridge declared, having already decided the matter. "Thomas has impeccable breeding, understands plantation management, and will provide the steady male guidance you require." Sarah met Thomas twice before reaching her conclusion. He was weak, vain, and deeply in debt, which made him perfect for her purposes. "I'll agree to the match," she told Breckenridge, "under specific conditions. A prenuptial contract giving me sole management of Bell River. Thomas receives an annual income but no decision-making authority over plantation operations, and the marriage doesn't take place until my sister's match is also arranged." Those terms are highly irregular. Those terms are non-negotiable. Thomas is desperate enough to agree. "We both know it." Breckenridge sputtered but couldn't argue with the assessment. Thomas did agree, signing a prenuptial contract that essentially made him a paid figurehead in exchange for respectability and freedom from his creditors. Catherine's match proved more difficult. Edmund Varley had grown impatient and shifted his attention to a widow in Montgomery. The executors rejected 3 other candidates for various reasons. Time was running short. They had until February 1849, and it was already October 1847. Then Catherine made a suggestion that changed everything. "What if I don't marry at all?" Sarah looked up from the ledgers they'd been reviewing. "The will requires both of us. The will requires both of us to marry within 24 months. It says nothing about remaining married. I could marry, become pregnant, and then accidents happen, especially to sickly husbands." The room fell silent. Marcus, sitting at the desk where he'd been copying correspondence, felt ice water run down his spine. "You're suggesting murder," he said quietly. "I'm suggesting that we fulfill the letter of Father's will through whatever means necessary," Catherine replied. "He never specified the husbands had to survive." "Catherine," Sarah began, "don't pretend you haven't thought about it. Thomas Breckenridge is going to be a problem. He's weak but not stupid. Once you're married, he'll try to assert authority, pregnancy or not. Men like that always do. They can't help themselves." Sarah didn't argue, which was answer enough. Marcus understood in that moment that he'd badly miscalculated. He'd thought the twins were victims of their circumstances, trapped women trying to escape their father's control through desperate means. But they were their father's daughters in ways that went deeper than blood. They'd learned to view people as obstacles to be managed or removed. "If you're planning to kill anyone," he said carefully, "I want no part of it. That's not what I agreed to." You agreed to do what we say, Catherine reminded him. And you'll keep doing it because the alternative is being sold south, remember? Then sell me south. I won't be party to murder. The twins exchanged glances. Sarah spoke first, her voice softer. Catherine's talking theoretically. We're not planning to kill anyone, but she's right that we need to consider all possibilities. This situation is more complicated than we anticipated. Marcus didn't believe her, but he also recognized he had no good options. If he refused to cooperate, they could indeed sell him away, and his documentation would be lost. If he reported their plans to authorities, he'd be dismissed, a slave's word against white women's, and likely executed for daring to make accusations. So he did what enslaved people had always done. He nodded, agreed, and began planning how to protect himself when the inevitable violence came. November brought the first frost and a new development. Sarah's wedding to Thomas Breckenridge was scheduled for December 15th. The ceremony would take place at Bell River, with Reverend Yates officiating. Catherine would serve as maid of honor. The executors would attend to witness the fulfillment of the first condition. But behind the wedding preparations, darker plans took shape. Sarah and Marcus began their physical relationship in early November, clinical encounters that took place in the locked study after Catherine retired. Sarah approached it with the same cold efficiency she applied to plantation management. This was reproduction, not intimacy, a biological function necessary to achieve a goal. Marcus found it profoundly disturbing, not because of the racial taboo they were violating, though that danger hovered over every encounter, but because of the emotional emptiness of it, the way Sarah could separate physical acts from human connection so completely. My father did this to dozens of women, she said one night afterward as they lay apart on the study floor, forced them into exactly this situation. And I swore I'd never be like him. Yet here I am. You're not forcing me, Marcus said, though it wasn't entirely true. The threat of being sold south hung over everything. Aren't I? You're enslaved. By definition, you can't consent. I tell myself this is different because I'm offering you freedom afterward. Because we're partners in this deception. But we're not partners. I own you. There's no consent possible in that dynamic. It was the most honest thing she'd said to him. And it made everything worse because it meant she understood exactly what she was doing and did it anyway. By mid-November, Sarah was pregnant. Dr. Grayfield confirmed it during a visit to check on the syphilis treatments. The executors were delighted. One condition satisfied, one more to go. Thomas Breckenridge, who'd arrived at Bell River 2 weeks earlier to prepare for the wedding, accepted the news with the oblivious pleasure of a man who believed his own virility explained everything. Catherine's situation remained unresolved. She'd rejected 6 potential husbands, frustrating the executors and running the calendar dangerously close to the deadline. Then, in early December, she made an announcement. I've found someone acceptable, Mr. Lawrence Kemper, widower, age 51, with a small plantation in Wilcox County. Moderate means respectable reputation, no children from his first marriage. I'll need to meet him, Breckenridge said. Of course, he'll visit next week. Lawrence Kemper arrived on December 8th. A thin, nervous man with graying hair and a persistent cough that suggested consumption. He spoke little, deferred to Catherine constantly, and seemed pathetically grateful for her attention. He's perfect, Catherine told Marcus after Kemper had left, dying slowly, desperate for companionship, and too weak to assert any authority. The executors will approve him because he meets their surface criteria, and he'll be dead within a year, leaving me a widow free to do as I please. You're going to let him die of consumption? I'm going to let nature take its course. Is that murder, Marcus? Marrying a sick man knowing he won't survive? Marcus had no answer that didn't sound like moral evasion. Sarah's wedding took place on a cold, clear December day. 40 guests attended, filling Bell River's parlor with the smell of perfume and wood smoke from the fireplaces. Reverend Yates performed the ceremony with his usual ponderous solemnity. Thomas Breckenridge looked pleased with himself, clearly believing he'd secured a valuable prize. Sarah wore a dress of ivory silk that Catherine had sewn, and her expression throughout the ceremony was as blank as a porcelain doll's. Marcus watched from the back of the room, technically serving as additional household staff for the event. He saw Sarah speak her vows without hesitation, saw her accept Thomas's kiss with perfect composure, saw her smile and accept congratulations from guests who had no idea what kind of performance they were witnessing. That night, after the guests had departed and Thomas had drunk himself into a stupor in his new quarters, Sarah came to the study where Marcus waited. "It's done," she said simply. "The first condition is satisfied." "And Thomas?" "Will do as he's told. I made that very clear during our wedding night conversation. He gets a comfortable life, an annual income, and the appearance of authority. In exchange, he stays out of my way and doesn't ask questions about how this plantation operates." He agreed to that. He agreed to avoid being exposed as a fraud who embezzled from his business partners in New Orleans. "I purchased his cooperation with threats, Marcus, the same way I purchased yours. I'm my father's daughter, remember?" The bitterness in her voice was new, and Marcus recognized it as dangerous. Sarah was beginning to hate herself for what she was becoming, which meant she might do something unpredictable to prove she was different from her father, or something terrible to prove she didn't care. Catherine's wedding was scheduled for January 20th, 1848. The executors approved Lawrence Kemper after minimal scrutiny. His background checked out, his property holdings were legitimate, and his desperate eagerness to remarry blinded them to any potential issues. But in the weeks between the two weddings, something shifted at Belle River. The house staff began whispering about arguments between the twins, raised voices behind closed doors. Pritchett reported that both women seemed distracted, making decisions about plantation management and then countermanding them hours later. Marcus knew what was happening. The strain of maintaining their deception, combined with Sarah's growing self-loathing and Catherine's increasingly cold calculation, was fracturing their previously united front. It came to a head the night before Catherine's wedding. Marcus was in the study, working on his secret documentation, when he heard screams from upstairs. He rushed up to find Sarah and Catherine in Sarah's bedroom. Catherine with blood running from her nose, Sarah with scratch marks on her face. "She wants to kill him," Sarah shouted when she saw Marcus. "Not just let him die, actually poison him." "He's dying anyway," Catherine screamed back. "Why wait? Why risk him changing his mind about the marriage terms? We dose him with arsenic. He's dead in 6 months. I'm a widow and pregnant, and we're done with all of this. Because that makes us murderers. Actual, deliberate murderers. We're already murderers. Or had you forgotten the coffee you served Father the night he died?" The room went silent. Marcus stared at the twins, understanding flooding through him with sickening clarity. "You killed your father," he said. Sarah sank onto the bed, her face in her hands. "Arsenic mixed with powdered glass in his coffee. Small amounts over 3 weeks. Made it look like heart failure. Doctor." Grayfield never suspected because he wanted to believe it was natural causes. "We had to," Catherine said, her voice defiant. "He was going to sell Marcus and 3 other slaves to a trader from Mississippi. We overheard him making arrangements. And he was planning to force us into marriages with men he'd selected, men who would have helped him continue his breeding program. We had no choice." "There's always a choice," Marcus said quietly. "Easy for you to say," Catherine snapped. "You're not trapped in a cage built by a man who viewed you as a biological experiment. I'm trapped in a cage too, just a different kind, and I've never killed anyone to escape it." The argument might have continued, but they heard footsteps on the stairs. Thomas, stumbling drunkenly toward his wife's bedroom. The 3 conspirators fell silent, listening to him curse as he fumbled with the door handle, then give up and shuffle away. After he'd gone, Sarah spoke quietly. "We can't do this again. Catherine, if you poison Lawrence, it's over. Someone will notice. Someone will investigate. And all of this, The plantation, our freedom, Marcus's documentation, all of it will be destroyed. Then what do you suggest? We're running out of time. We wait. We let nature take its course with Lawrence. We endure. And when it's finally over, when we've satisfied Father's conditions and secured the inheritance, then we decide who we want to be. Catherine didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was tired. I don't know if I can endure anymore. I don't know if there's anything left of me to save. Marcus, watching them, realized he'd been documenting the wrong story. He'd focused on the Colonel's atrocities, the systematic abuse, the breeding program. But the real horror of Bell River wasn't what had been done to enslaved people, though that was horror enough. It was what had been done to the twins themselves, the way their father had twisted them into weapons and then aimed them at each other. They were victims and perpetrators simultaneously, trapped in roles they hadn't chosen, but were now performing with increasing desperation. And Marcus was trapped with them, his own survival dependent on a scheme that seemed more likely every day to end in catastrophic violence. Catherine's wedding to Lawrence Kemper took place on January 20th, 1848, a smaller affair with only 20 guests. Kemper looked skeletal, his cough worsening in the January cold. He needed Catherine's support to walk to the parlor where Reverend Yates waited. The ceremony lasted 12 minutes. When Yates pronounced them married, Kemper attempted to kiss his bride but was seized by a coughing fit that left blood on his handkerchief. Consumption's got him good, Dr. Grayfield muttered to Breckenridge. Give him 6 months, maybe less. Lawrence Kemper moved into Bell River that evening, taking a bedroom far from Catherine's. He seemed pathetically grateful for every small kindness, thanking servants repeatedly for bringing him water and stoking his fire. Catherine and Marcus began their encounters in early February. Unlike Sarah's bitter honesty, Catherine treated it as another transaction to be completed efficiently. She scheduled specific times and afterward left without conversation. By March, Catherine was pregnant. Lawrence Kemper, confined to his bed by worsening illness, accepted the news with confused pleasure. Thank God, he wheezed. You'll have something to remember me by. The executors visited in April to verify both pregnancies. They found everything in order. Both twins married, both pregnant, cotton production maintained. Breckenridge pronounced himself satisfied. Meanwhile, Marcus spent his nights documenting everything. He now had evidence of the Colonel's breeding program, the syphilis epidemic, the poisoning, and the marriage scheme. But he still couldn't figure out how to get the documents north without being caught. In May, a traveling preacher named Jacob Sturgis arrived, claiming to collect missionary donations. During dinner, Sturgis mentioned spending time in Philadelphia. Marcus caught the emphasis, a known abolitionist center. He made a small hand gesture, a sign used by Underground Railroad operatives. Sturgis paused mid-sentence, his eyes flickering to Marcus, then continued without missing a beat. Later, Marcus approached him near the stable. I have documents. Evidence of crimes. It needs to reach Philadelphia. After consideration, Sturgis agreed. Marcus spent 10 days copying his most crucial documentation onto thin paper, writing in microscopic hand. He documented the Colonel's experiments, the forced breeding, the syphilis epidemic, the poisoning, and his own role in the twins' scheme. He enlisted Isaiah, a field worker, to deliver the documents to Sturgis in Selma. 2 weeks later, Isaiah returned confirming delivery. Marcus felt simultaneously liberated and terrified. The evidence now existed beyond the twins' control. But if discovered, he was a dead man. Summer brought mounting tension. Sarah's pregnancy advanced normally, though she grew increasingly withdrawn. Thomas Breckenridge took to drinking heavily. Lawrence Kemper lingered in his sick room, attended by patient servants. Then Sarah began visiting Lawrence, bringing him books. He'd been a teacher once, he explained. Before inheriting a plantation, he'd never learned to manage properly. I'm just a school teacher who wanted to read books, he said weakly. Is that so terrible? Sarah had no answer. On August 17, 1848, Lawrence Kemper died in his sleep from consumption. He was buried 3 days later, his brief presence memorialized with a simple headstone. Lawrence Kemper, 1797–1848, he found peace at the end. Catherine was now a pregnant widow, the will's conditions fulfilled. But something changed in her after Lawrence's death, guilt, even though she hadn't actively killed him. In mid-September, a woman appeared claiming to be the colonel's half-sister, threatening lawsuits if not given a settlement. The twins knew she was a fraud, but before they could act, she approached Pritchett with a bribery offer. Pritchett reported it immediately. Armed with this evidence, the twins confronted the fraud and her lawyer in Hayneville. The meeting was brief and brutal. They left Alabama within 24 hours, but the incident revealed their vulnerability. Until the babies were born, they remained targets. In late October, everything nearly unraveled. Thomas Breckinridge, drunk after winning at cards, mentioned that Sarah had been pregnant within weeks of their marriage. Surprisingly quick timing. Word spread through Lowndes County within days. The scandal hit Bell River like a thunderstorm. Breckinridge arrived demanding explanations. Sarah made a decision. She stood before prominent neighbors, 7 months pregnant, and delivered a calculated confession. "I was violated," she said steadily. "Before our marriage, Thomas and I were intimate. I became pregnant. Rather than cancel the marriage and face ruin, we proceeded with the ceremony. It was wrong, it was sinful, but it doesn't invalidate our father's will." The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. Premarital intimacy was scandalous but not unprecedented. Sarah's frank admission made the story believable, a lie that protected the greater deception underneath. "What about your sister?" Breckinridge asked. "Catherine's situation is entirely proper." Breckinridge studied her carefully but had no evidence to disprove her story. "This matter is closed," he declared finally. "The will's conditions have been met." After everyone left, Sarah collapsed in the parlor, her composure finally breaking. Sarah went into labor on November 14, 1848. The labor lasted 18 hours. At dawn on November 15th, a baby's cry pierced the morning silence. "A girl," the midwife announced. "Small but healthy." Sarah lay exhausted against the pillows, her daughter wrapped in blankets beside her. The baby had dark hair and ambiguous features, useful in a house built on lies. "She's free," Sarah whispered. "That's all that matters." Catherine delivered on December 7th after 12 difficult hours, the umbilical cord wrapped around the baby's neck. The midwife worked with calm efficiency until a weak cry confirmed survival. "Another girl," she said. "She's a fighter." Catherine looked at her daughter, darker than Sarah's child, with features requiring careful explanation. "I'm calling her Ruth, after our mother. And mine will be Abigail," Sarah said through tears, "after the grandmother we never knew." The names honored women their father had erased. They were the first decisions the twins had made that weren't calculated for advantage. Simply mothers naming their daughters. The executors visited on December 20th to verify both births and finalize the estate transfer. Breckinridge examined the babies clinically, noted their existence, and pronounced the will's conditions fully satisfied. Bell River Plantation is hereby transferred to Sarah Breckinridge and Catherine Kemper. The estate is officially closed. After he left, Sarah felt nothing. No triumph, no relief, just exhaustion. They'd won, but the cost had been enormous. Marcus entered carrying Abigail. She wants her mother. As Sarah took her daughter, she made a decision. "We're keeping our promise. Your manumission papers will be filed next week. Funds sufficient to reach Philadelphia and establish yourself there." Marcus had been expecting delays. The directness caught him off guard. Just like that. "We made an agreement. I'm honoring it." "And the documents I sent north?" Sarah's eyes narrowed. "I know about those. Pritchett intercepts all correspondence. I know what was in them. Everything about Father's programs, the poisoning, our arrangement. Then why didn't you? Because you were right to document it. Someone needs to tell the truth. Maybe your testimony will reach people who can change things." Catherine appeared with Ruth. "We're not stopping you, but we're asking for 6 months. Stay until June, help stabilize operations. Then leave with our blessing and enough money to start fresh. It was masterful manipulation, but also honest. 6 months, he agreed. The winter passed in relative peace. Syphilis treatments continued, with several making full recoveries. The twins settled into motherhood while maintaining efficient plantation operations. Marcus spent evenings preparing for departure, but found himself reluctant to leave. He'd developed attachment to the children he'd fathered and complicated understanding of the twins themselves. Victims attempting to escape victimhood, trying to be better than they'd been raised to be. In March, a letter arrived from Pennsylvania addressed to Marcus. It was from Jacob Sturgis. The testimony had reached the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. They were compiling it for a report on Alabama plantations. Father's legacy will be exposure and condemnation, Sarah said quietly. Everything he believed will be used as evidence of the system's depravity. He was a monster, Marcus said. I know, but he was also my father. They moved Marcus's departure to mid-April. The night before he left, Sarah called him to the study. I've been thinking about what we did, she said. We convinced ourselves we were different from father because we offered you freedom, but we weren't different. We just used more sophisticated coercion. I know. And yet you stayed the extra months, completed the treatments. You fulfilled your bargain even after you knew I'd discovered your documentation. Sarah handed him a satchel heavy with gold coins. This is more than we agreed. There are also letters of introduction to merchants who won't question a freed slave with proper papers. Why? Because Abigail and Ruth will ask about their father someday. I want to tell them he was a good man who made difficult choices, who documented truth when others wanted it buried. Catherine appeared with both babies. We're saying goodbye properly, as families should. Marcus held his daughters one last time, memorizing their faces. Be good, he whispered. Be better than all of us. Marcus left Bell River on April 18, 1849. He carried his papers and a daguerreotype Sarah had commissioned secretly, him holding both girls. On the back, Marcus and his daughters, April 1849. May they all find freedom. He reached Mobile and secured passage north. The ship departed April 23rd. He never returned to Alabama, but his testimony did. The Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society published their report in July 1849, detailing plantation conditions and naming Colonel Nathaniel Sutton specifically. It caused outrage in northern states and fury in southern ones. In August, Harold Breckinridge began asking questions about how Bell River information had reached Pennsylvania. On September 3rd, he arrived with a sheriff and warrant to search for evidence of abolitionist activity. Marcus was manumitted, Sarah replied calmly. He left with our blessing. Whatever he did after is his business. He stole property, your father's journals. My father's journals passed to us. We gave Marcus access as part of his duties. What he did with that access is speculation. The search lasted 3 hours. They found nothing. Catherine had burned everything potentially incriminating weeks earlier. Breckinridge was forced to leave empty-handed, though his parting words carried threat. This isn't over. Eventually, someone will find the truth. After he left, Catherine said, "We need to disappear." It took 6 weeks. They sold Bell River for immediate cash, manumitted several key people with funds to establish themselves, and sold the remaining population to a Quaker merchant who'd promised transport to free states. Thomas received his property and cash settlement for agreeing never to contest the sale. On October 14, 1849, Sarah and Catherine boarded a ship in Mobile bound for New Orleans, traveling as widows with infant daughters. But before leaving Alabama, they made one final stop. On October 15th, a fire started in the Hayneville courthouse basement. The building burned for 6 hours, collapsing before dawn. 3 bodies were found, identified as vagrants seeking shelter, though no one looked carefully at why they'd been chained in the basement. The investigation concluded an overturned lamp caused the accidental fire. Most county records from 1847-1849 were destroyed. Anyone trying to trace Belle River's history would find only fragments and gaps. Sarah and Catherine reached Wisconsin in December 1849. They purchased a small farm outside Madison using false identities, presenting themselves as widowed sisters starting over. Their daughters grew up knowing only that their mothers had come from Alabama, had escaped difficult circumstances, and that their father had been a good man who'd made sacrifices. Marcus established himself in Philadelphia as a bookkeeper. He never married, never had other children, never spoke publicly about Alabama. But he continued providing testimony and helped transport escaped slaves until the Civil War began. He kept the daguerreotype hidden, taking it out occasionally to look at his daughters' faces. In 1863, a Union lieutenant discovered a sealed trunk in Belle River's ruins containing journals and breeding logs that confirmed everything in the report and added new horrors. The documents became part of the case for why slavery needed complete abolition. Colonel Nathaniel Sutton's legacy became exactly what his daughters predicted: exposure, condemnation, evidence of systematic evil. But the full truth about Sarah and Catherine, about Marcus and the children, remained hidden in burned records and carefully constructed lies. The courthouse fire was never solved, the bodies never identified, the documents never recovered. And the truth about the Alabama twin sisters who shared one male slave between them until they both got pregnant remained buried in ash and silence for over a century. Some historians claim the story is fabricated, that no records exist to support the alleged events. Others point to the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society's report and argue that where there's documentation, there's truth. But perhaps it doesn't matter whether every detail is verifiable. What matters is what the story reveals about the system that made such events not only possible, but almost inevitable. A system built on treating human beings as property, on using violence and deception as tools of control. The Sutton twins, if they existed, were both victims and perpetrators. Marcus, if he lived, was both collaborator and resistance fighter. The children inherited a legacy of trauma and survival, guilt and resilience. And the rest of us inherit the responsibility to remember, to examine, and to ensure that the conditions that created such horrors never exist again. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried in those burned records? Leave your comment below with your thoughts on what really happened at Belle River Plantation. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark mysteries from forgotten American history, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the disturbing truths hidden in our past. The next story might be even more unsettling than this one. Until then, remember that history's darkest chapters are often the ones people tried hardest to erase.